I'm Yasmin Sooka. I'm a South African human rights lawyer, and I served on the South African and Sierra Leone Truth Commissions. I was also a member of the panel of advisors investigating allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity in Sri Lanka during the final phase of the war in 2009.
Yasmin, we are in Johannesburg, where today at 1 p.m. we have a protest, Palestinian protest now. I've been contacted by friends all across the globe. In Bangladesh, they're doing a major protest. All of this is going on, and we are watching in real time a genocide taking place. We feel helpless, but we can't be. We have to do what we can. But you know of the situation in Sri Lanka, the situation in India. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened behind the scenes there? We were talking earlier about the interview that Francesca was doing in Sri Lanka. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Sri Lanka is one of, I guess, probably one of the first wars in the last sort of 2 decades where you were actually able to see what was happening in real time, but you also had quite a sense of helplessness about what was going on. In Sri Lanka, what was really, I think, it began to upturn all of the laws of war as we know them. And in fact, the government was able to get away with targeting civilians and killing them, and really nobody in the international community did much about that. There are 2 things that really stand out about that conflict. In 2008, the international community was asked to leave what then became known as the war zone. And in fact, all of them knew that the reason for that was to make sure that there would be no real images of what was going on in the conflict, and yet they did, and they left civilians to, in fact, pursue their own fate. And if you look at the scenes of how civilians were crying and pleading with them to come back, I think it's really, really quite striking. A second incident that really stood out was the fact that you had the political wing of the Liberation Tamil Tigers, who indicated by, I think, the 14th of May that they were willing to lay down their arms and surrender, because by that time the RTTE had become quite a spent force, and the political wing had been part of the peace negotiations, and they were assured at the highest level. Palita Kahona was a spokesperson for the government, had been in touch with the Rajapaksa brothers, and in fact he told the head of the RTT's political wing that what they should do is come out under the safety of a white flag. Now, there were 3 different groups that followed in succession, and on that fateful day, the 17th of May, they crossed the Vadukal Bridge, and they were met there by Shivendra Silva, and there were a number of eyewitnesses who actually saw them shaking hands with the members of the 58th Division, and a half an hour later their bodies were strewn on the side. They had been executed by the Sri Lankan military, and from what we know, these were under the orders of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was then the Secretary of Defense, and he had apparently given orders that nobody should be left alive. With the political wing were many civilians, family members of people in the LTTE political wing who would lay down their arms. One group, in fact, was a priest, a Catholic priest, Father Francis, and with him, what was really strange about the incident with him was that I think he was the 3rd or the 4th group that followed, and he was writing down the names of people who were in the group to make sure that there was an accurate record of who was alive at the time. And people were then put on buses, and everybody who got on that bus, nobody has ever returned alive. They remain people who some people consider to have been disappeared. Other people know that in actual fact, people on the buses were taken away and they were executed in cold blood. And amongst them were many, many children. So it gives you a sense of what I would call, in international law, you have a concept called perfidy. And that is when you trap the other side into believing that they will be protected, and the next thing that happens, you're taken out and you're executed. And that's what the military and the Gotabayas at Rajapaksa was actually responsible for. But I think where you have a real sense of where the Israelis have watched the Sri Lankan playbook and have probably been in touch with them is around, the fact that the Sri Lankan government in that final phase of the war, they declared unilaterally what we call no-fire safe zones. The first no-fire safe zone, civilians, saw leaflets which were dropped from the air, and they were told to congregate in these zones. And then the moment that they did, the bombing and the shelling started, and people were forced to flee. And when you actually look at the scenes of what happened, you see people, using bundles of clothing, trying to hide beneath it, because you're out in the open air. And as one victim once told me, you leave the dead and the wounded behind because you just can't manage to carry them. Then people fled to the second, fire safe zone. And again, the shelling and the bombing started. And then finally, when they were on a small piece of land on the lagoon, I think it's no bigger than Hyde Park, if you can imagine Hyde Park, and you had more than 300,000 people in the small space of land, and the shelling and the firing began, and again people were slaughtered. I mean, this is the execution of civilians, a targeted killing of them. But what was worse was that there were government doctors who were accompanying the civilians, and the government doctors sent out word to the Minister of Health that we need medical supplies, we need to be able to carry out operations. And in fact, what the Minister of Health said, well, none of you are surgeons, so we don't know what operations you are carrying out. And in fact, they limited the supply of medicines meant for civilians. In addition to that, the government was still constantly by the humanitarians about the numbers of people in the no-fire safe zones. And even though there were 300,000 people there, the government said, well, there are only 75,000 people by our count. And so the amount of food that they sent in just couldn't satisfy. People were starving, and children were dying because of hunger. And when you look at the kind of makeshift operations that the doctors were carrying out, it's really, I think, an abomination that a government is allowed to kill its own citizens in this way. Because these are not people who come from anywhere else. These are Tamil people who came from the south of Sri Lanka, the north of Sri Lanka, and who are Sri Lankan citizens, all of them civilians, and they were taken out and killed. What happened to the doctors as well is that the doctors were taken out by the military, they were held in detention, and they were asked to recant on the messages that they had sent out about the numbers of people who were in the war zone, and also about the shortage of food and medicine and the starvation that followed. And in fact, one of them was tortured, and he was then forced to go to a public press briefing and say that in fact he had lied when he had sent these messages to the outside world about the number of civilians in the war zone and the fact that there was starvation and that medicines had been refused to the people who were in the war zone. And many years later, when he managed to leave the country, he actually wrote a book, and in fact he began to speak to the world and tell them about what his experiences were and how the military in fact had threatened to keep him in detention for a much longer period and torture him if he did not go publicly and in fact recant on what he had said. And in fact he's written a book about it, which would be something that is worth reading by everybody, because you begin to get a sense of how in modern times state-sponsored violence works, and how the state can deprive civilians of all of the amenities which are meant to keep them alive, and in fact deprive them of these sorts of essentials. A few weeks ago, of course, Mehdi Hassan, in his very popular TV show Head to Head, interviewed Ranil Wickremesinghe, who was at one point the former president of Sri Lanka during the period of Gotabaya Rajapaksa's tenure, and then later on became the president himself. And Mehdi, in fact, invited him to be more candid about what had happened during Sri Lanka during that period. And my colleague Frances Harrison, who was on that show as one of the expert panelists, was able to take Ranil on about massacres that he allegedly was also complicit in, and how he had also turned a blind eye to what the Rajapaksa regime had done to ordinary civilians. But at the end of the show, almost, when Mehdi invited people from the audience to speak, Callum McRae, who really made the famous documentary, The Killing Fields, on Sri Lanka, and who also assisted Francis, David, and myself to make a documentary on the protest in Sri Lanka at Chatrabari police station, Callum asked Ranil a question. He said, "Is it true that the Sri Lankan government has in fact been giving advice to the Israeli government about how you deal with killing civilians, how you ensure that you deprive them of food and medicines and objects necessary to their survival? And in fact that there's a huge collaboration between your two governments," and he was talking of the previous Sri Lankan regime, and that what is happening in Gaza is almost a perfect replica of what was done in Sri Lanka during the final phase of the war in 2009. And I think that's a very hard lesson for most of us, because it does mean that everything that we've done in the last 75 years around building up what the rules are when you conduct a war, what humanitarian law is about, and international criminal law, as well as international human rights law, all of that is upturned because the international community has failed to take steps against those in Israel who have been responsible for what is probably the worst carnage in this last 2 decades that we have ever seen in the world. The scenes of children and women are just unforgettable. And the fact that, Mr. Trump wants to turn Gaza into another Riviera is obscene. And I hope that people who believe in justice all over the world are going to oppose what the state of Israel is doing and what the American government proposes to do as well. And what we should do is echo the example, I think, of lawyers who have formed, an association in the United Kingdom, and whose intention is to make sure that no Israeli leader who visits any country is safe from being arrested, because they've said that they will conduct private prosecutions if necessary. If a government fails to take action and do their jobs as they should do, then these civilians are going to do it for them. And that's what we all have to do. Refuse to be part of allowing such injustices to carry on. Otherwise, we too are going to be complicit.
In talking about Sri Lanka, you mentioned how Israel follows from the Sri Lankan playbook, but nowadays there are people who talk about how India is following the Israeli playbook and perhaps repeating that exercise. Would you talk about that? But also the fact that Western media and Western governments, by and large, are not merely complicit but actively collaborating in this exercise.
Well, the Indian government, I think they could teach a number of governments a thing or two about state-sponsored violence, because when you look at what India has done, I mean, when you look at the pogroms that took place in Gujarat, popularly known as the bakery cases, and you look at how many innocent people were killed in those pogroms, it gives you a sense of what India itself was capable of. And you see, I think, very much the same thing having been repeated in places like Manipur, and then, of course, in Kashmir as well. But the Sri Lankans, of course, know too well what the Indian military forces are capable of. In Sri Lanka and India concluded an agreement in which the Indians sent what they called peacekeeping forces to the north of the country. And in the period that they were there in a place called Valivetru, they were responsible for the massacre of many hundreds of innocent civilians. And this year, the International Truth and Justice Project released a report on a particular massacre that took place in what became known as the VVT massacre. And when you look at the kind of atrocities that were carried out by military officials there, nobody in the Indian peacekeeping forces ever been held to account. And really, I've always said to people who are doing documentation that it's important to preserve archives, and that's the first thing you should seize when you have a transition, is look at all of the records that are out there, because usually those go into being burnt as quickly as possible, or in fact shredded. But what was really fortunate was that there was a man, a teacher in this village, who in fact after the massacre went around documenting and ensuring that the name of every person in that village who had been killed was collected. He managed to gather a number of testimonies. I think there were more than 100 in total. And in fact, he actually did go to India and try to raise awareness of it at the time. I think the massacre was around the 1987 period, but nobody took notice of him, and he wrote a book as well. But we were able to use the affidavits that he had collected and to reconstruct the story. And as a result of that, we were able to put together this report, which was launched in Sri Lanka last month. But we were able to also use the information to identify a number of senior military officials who were in the peacekeeping force at the time. And in fact, we've made submissions to the United States at the time when it was under another president, in fact, to have some of those officers sanctioned. And if you are put under a visa sanction, you can't travel, neither can your family, and any assets that you have abroad will in fact be seized. And so that's one way, if you cannot have criminal accountability, to actually begin to hold people accountable. And so I think that what we are seeing, and a colleague, Harsh Manda, wrote a very powerful article the other day in which he talked about India's complicity in supporting the government of Israel in the kind of conflict that it is carrying out, the war really against civilians in Palestine. And, there's just absolutely no accountability for that. Now, when you look at the media, I think in the West and of course in many countries, it struck me that you always have the emphasis on what Hamas did, but you never actually have a real sense of any kind of condemnation of what the Israelis are able to do. And I think the question that we have to ask many countries is, how is it that they continue to support the government of Israel? Why do they continue to supply them with weapons? Why is there no real attempt to ensure that in fact this conflict stops? And you just get a sense that the gloves are off, and that any effort now by the Israeli government is that they're going to decimate people completely, and that's why all of us need to stand up. But and it's about the hypocrisy that really exists in the world, even as governments say, there needs to be a ceasefire, hostilities need to end. I think what we're talking about is hostilities against the civilian population. And the only group that really need to, in fact, cease and desist is the Israeli government. And the IDF should, in fact, be held accountable for the crimes that they are committing there. I mean, it's no secret that this is probably one of those conflicts where there is a great deal of footage on social media, because, strangely enough, the soldiers take footage of themselves committing these kinds of atrocities, and that will one day become very powerful evidence in the hands of any accountability, should Israel ever be held accountable, and the military and political leadership as well. But you have to ask the question, why is it possible to see these scenes on television every day? But why isn't it possible for the world to put a stop to it? It just begs the question of the inability to be able to manage this particular conflict. And that's really a shame, because it's, you're targeting people who don't have guns to fire back. They're being starved, medicine is being withheld. And when you look at children scrounging around for meals, the fact that the humanitarians are not allowed to go into there. Why is Egypt not opening these gates to allow access? Why aren't the Gulf states not putting more pressure on Mr. Trump? They're the only ones with the power actually to deal with a very powerful government, and yet you don't see that effort actually taking place. And that's one day going to haunt them as well.
You mentioned the complicity of certain countries, certainly India and the Gulf countries, but there has been an arrest warrant by the ICC on Netanyahu, and right now he's just gone to the United States, crossing the airspace of Italy and France, and they had a responsibility to stop that. Do you have any comment on that?
I think that I think it was the prosecutor as well as a commentator who said that the setting up of the International Criminal Court was certainly an attempt by the West to hold leadership from the African countries or third world countries, and was never intended really for people like the West or Mr. Netanyahu. I can understand that a country like Hungary could host him, and of course Hungary has said that it's going to withdraw from the Rome Statute. But there's really, I think, a very big question to France and to Italy. Why have they made no attempt to arrest him? I recall that many, many years ago, I think in London, there was an arrest warrant for Zipi Livni, and lawyers who supported the Palestinian cause certainly made sure that Zipi Livni could not get off her aircraft because she feared that she would be arrested. Why are similar things not happening in Italy and France? And I think that's a question that all of us should ask, because France particular holds itself out as the bastion of standing for accountability. But certainly in this case, they just don't seem to want to take action at all. The United States, as we know, is already in the process of targeted sanctions against ICC personnel. And I think that if they could destroy the International Criminal Court, then certainly they will. So that question, when someone has been served with an arrest warrant, why you don't implement your obligations, I think is a question. But the other is a question, I think countries like the United States and many European countries that have provided equipment and arms to the Israelis are going to have to deal with the question of, once the indictment had taken place, then they really are notice that they in fact may be aiding and abetting war criminals, and that's something that we also need to unpack going forward.